Welcome everyone to the APJ Chat, a special program brought to you by the Africa Policy Journal from the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Chieza Juru, the Deputy Editor-in-Chief at the APJ. Today we're joined by a very special guest, the Zimbabwean Ambassador to the United States of America, His Excellency Ambassador Chifamba. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Ambassador, you spoke at the Kennedy School around the issue of Africa not being a prey, Africa demanding equal partnership, a seat at the table by way of how we relate with the world, how we engage in trade with everybody else. And when we look at history, for example, the 1884 Berlin Conference, we saw the scramble for Africa. And in some ways, there are similarities today when we look at how superpowers such as the United States, China, are also looking at their interests in Africa. But the question is, what are the interests of Africa? What are our own priorities? And do you see Africa as a potential major player on the global stage?
Well, thank you, Chieza. You spoke of 1884 Berlin Conference. Of course, that was the conference to partition Africa into some very small colonies, some of them non-viable economic entities. I mean, the way that Africa was partitioned really defied even the existing nation states. And some of these boundaries literally cut through those states, which led to the division of Africa, the weakening of Africa. But the Africa we are talking about today is an Africa of independent states. We all fought for our independence to rid ourselves of colonialism. But even as independent states, we have continued to suffer from the scars of colonialism. Ghana being the first to be independent. If you remember the Kwame Nkrumah dictum of seek ye first the political kingdom. Of course, we sought the political kingdom, but everything else did not follow. We still have some difficulties in terms of achieving economic independence, largely because of the tentacles which were established through colonialism and neocolonialism. So the challenge that Africa faces today is to push for economic liberation. And how are we doing it? We are doing it by remodeling or reshaping our relations with the former colonial powers. We are redefining our relationship with our own God-given natural resources. If you want, we are beginning to see the rise of what I may call resource nationalism, because we face a serious paradox where Africa is endowed with a lot of mineral resources and other natural resources, potentially very rich continent, but its people are poor. So we are saying that there has to be a direct relationship between the African people and the African resources. Put differently, as we unlock value from African God-given resources, the benefit should accrue primarily to Africans. And of course, we can share also access to some of these God-given natural resources with everybody else on the globe. But on our terms, you see, what is critical really is that over the time that we experience colonization and the immediate period after colonization, we have tended to continue to be exporters of raw materials, but we want to see beneficiation, value addition happening in Africa. For as long as we are exporting primary commodities and primary products, it means that we are exporting quality jobs. It means that we will continue to be underdeveloped. So the struggle that we are currently pursuing is to ensure that Africa is given space to value add its resources. And as we negotiate with other countries on the world, we are saying we negotiate on the basis of what we have, as negotiating leverage. We have the minerals, we have other raw materials. even agro-based. And our partners are coming on the table with their capital, with their technology, So we should be able to strike mutually beneficial partnerships out of this kind of arrangement. Our future as Africa does not depend on aid. It depends on mutually beneficial partnerships. So yes, we want to be considered as an equal player in today's world, because we are no longer talking about colonial Africa. We are talking about independent Africa.
Thank you. And you mentioned an important point around the resources that Africa has. And when you look at it, in order for Africa to be relevant, we need to start operating collectively. We will not be relevant if we're operating as single countries. Our trade within Africa has been around 15 to 16%, which is why the African Continental Free Trade Area is very critical. And so my question is, where are we in terms of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area, and what do we need to do for us to expedite it?
Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area is quite a recent creation. So far, 46 out of the 54 countries have acceded or ratified the treaty. Only a few countries still remain outside it. Most of the negotiations are done, except for a few product lines where we are still having some difficulties. Areas such as textiles, clothing, sugar, maybe automobiles as well. But we believe that we can speed up implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area if we proceed on the basis of variable geometry. Not all countries will be ready to go full steam at the same time. So those who can accelerate implementation will be able to do so. But let me just draw your attention to something that has been happening even prior to the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is the regional integration schemes, SADC, COMESA, ECOWAS, etc. This was also Africa's effort to try and integrate our economies in order to realize economies of scale. I do not believe that these regional communities contradict the Continental Free Trade. In fact, they help to enhance it, in the sense that what had been achieved over time through these sub-regional organizations or integration initiatives can now be consolidated, within the African Continental Free Trade Area. So a lot is happening. Intra-Africa trade is low at 15%, as you said, because to a large extent, we produce more or less the same kind of products. But now with a lot of investment coming into infrastructure, and thanks to our partnership with China, we are now linked, as countries, and there are also links as cities. And this creates a good condition for us to establish even regional value chains. And we are now aiming even to achieve continental value chains as we implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Very exciting opportunities that you mentioned that the continent presents. And one of the things you spoke about is how a lot of Africans are freeing the continent. You have airlines that are filled with Africans who are pursuing greener pastures elsewhere. And the irony of the issue is the very same airlines are coming back to the continent. Europeans, Americans, other people that are seeing potential of Africa. So my question is, why are we not seeing the opportunities? Where are we getting it wrong, and what do we need to do in order to change that?
Well, I think the biggest challenge really is that Africans, especially the African youth, the kind of education that we have been giving them over time is to prepare them for employment, not necessarily for them to be entrepreneurs, etc. But I'll give you an example of my country, Zimbabwe, where our education system has now been redesigned so that we can base it on what we have as heritage. So you'll notice that we have universities and technical colleges in each and every province. We have 10 provinces. And as we pursue what we are calling Education 5.0, these universities have been challenged to be innovation hubs. So our Ministry of Higher Education, Science, Technology, and Innovation is challenging these universities to say, address the development challenges within your settings, within your areas, through innovation, through science and technology. This is something new that is coming up. And as a result, we are seeing a lot of interest now as our universities become, innovation hubs as well as industrial hubs. Good example is that during the COVID period, Zimbabwe moved very quickly to the manufacture of PPEs. It moved very quickly. Even we did manufacture our own oxygen. So this is the kind of effort that we are seeing, through this new approach to education. Initially, some people, if I were to go into some of the sectors, individual sectors like agriculture, initially when we started our land reform, some people, were shunning the idea of going into agriculture. But lo and behold, now a lot of young persons are going into agriculture for the productive utilization of those farms. The same is going into mining, and government has taken a deliberate policy to ensure that we do not continue to export jobs, because for some of the key minerals which we had hitherto been exporting as ore, government has taken a deliberate policy decision to say stop exportation of ore for your platinum group of metals, for your chrome, even gold. Government as late as February this year set aside some money to launch some gold processing centers. 6 of them have been established. And some resources have been set aside also to capacitate small-scale gold producers. So we are looking into all this lithium as well. Mm-hmm. We are saying you cannot export raw lithium. We want to see some value addition. So across the board, we have developed smelting capacity, for the platinum group of metals, for chrome. But we want to go beyond smelting. We want to do manufacturing. Even for things like lithium, we want to go into battery manufacturing. So we are beginning to really challenge and create opportunities for our youth to be able to make full benefits, or to derive full benefits from the resources that we have. More and more, as I said, have gone into mining, into agriculture. They are seeing the opportunities. Whilst, of course, you continue to see others who will be looking for greener pastures elsewhere to be employed elsewhere. But more and more we are seeing our youth as employers in their own right. So this is something that is new. And obviously, I want to believe that the same is happening in many other African countries.
That's incredible. And it also presents an opportunity somehow when you look at youth that are now in the diaspora. I think one of our strengths as a country is our human capital. Both the local, those that have remained and are seeing the opportunities locally, but also the diaspora. They have acquired skills and knowledge over time. And so as an ambassador who deals with the diaspora community, how are you seeing the diaspora making contributions beyond foreign remittances? How do we create a platform for us to begin to actually get what I would call brain gain from this mass of diaspora people that have various skills? How do we connect them to the country?
Thanks for raising that question. In my diaspora outreach program, the message that I am carrying to our diaspora is to say that first and foremost, you are Zimbabweans, and therefore you have access to whatever opportunities Zimbabwe is offering to its people and to its youth. Things like access to mineral claims, access to land, if they want to farm, and access to any other opportunity if they want to invest back home. I'm also highlighting to them that they are in a privileged position in the sense that they have easy access where they are in the diaspora, easy access to capital. There are affordable loans here compared to, say, in Africa or in Zimbabwe in particular. They've access to technology, and given their networks, and we're at Harvard here, and we have a rich network, of innovators, who are fellow students, and even big industry is here. So you are so networked that you can easily identify potential joint venture partners here who can bring real value to Zimbabwe. So with all these advantages, our diaspora can actually do much more than just send money as remittances, which goes into consumption. I'm not saying that should stop. You should continue to send money to sustain families back home, to support families back home. But think of setting aside money for investment. I always give the example of some Nigerians in the UK who bought a lithium claim in Zimbabwe and are now scouting to employ Zimbabweans, even in the diaspora, to do the mining for them in Zimbabwe. What more you, as a Zimbabwean, it's your birthright. So I use that as a good example to challenge people in the diaspora to say the opportunities back home are for you, as Zimbabweans first and foremost.
Absolutely. Moving to the relations between the United States and Zimbabwe, I'm sure that's one big issue on your table. There have been misconceptions around sanctions. For example, whether the sanctions are targeted, whether they're economic sanctions. And I think Zimbabwe's stance over the past 2 decades has been a call for the removal of sanctions. We've seen other African countries also supporting this notion, the African Union also speaking on the need to remove sanctions from Zimbabwe. And so how are you dealing with this complex situation by way of negotiating with the United States, bringing them on the table as a potential partner? Are there any concessions, if any, that you're willing to make or that the United States would be willing to make in order for us to make progress on this issue so that Zimbabwe can be removed from sanctions and can thrive economically its plans?
At the time that the sanctions were imposed on us, and I want to quote one of the senior administration officials, Chester Crocker, he said the following: the sanctions are meant to make the economy scream and to separate the people from ZANU-PF. So clearly from the outset, these sanctions were a regime change agenda. And the Americans were taking that position in support of Tony Blair. It's a kith and kin thing. The sanctions were imposed because we had embarked on our accelerated land reform. So the fact that blacks were taking land away from whites or the settler community is what invited sanctions on Zimbabwe. Of course, Zidera tries to justify the sanctions on the basis of values. Things like democracy, governance, and elections. But really, that's not the issue. But even then, as Zimbabwe, we have been implementing a raft of economic and political reforms. And if you look at our performance in all those areas, whether it's governance, management of elections, etc., and compare ourselves with many African countries, even countries in Europe, and here in the United States, you can actually see that the standard which is being used to measure performance in Zimbabwe is extremely high, much higher than all of Africa, much higher than all of developing world, and much higher than some states within the United States itself. So we have a reforms implementation matrix, which is highlighting how far we have gone in further improving performance in those governance areas. Unfortunately, our hosts here don't seem to appreciate the progress we make. They continue to move the goalposts and make it extremely difficult for us to normalize relations. But like our president has said, Zimbabwe wants to be a friend to all and an enemy to none. He has also said that Zimbabwe is open for business. So President Mnangagwa is very much desirous to see us normalize relationships with America. And our message here has been to say, let's not confine or define our relationship in the very narrow space of those values of democracy, governance, and human rights. We are only 43 years, a very young democracy. The US has been on this democratic experiment for more than 230 years. But look, we are exactly at the same spot as we speak today, disputed elections, you know. And the United States also faces a lot of challenges domestically in terms of issues of human rights and governance. I mean, President Biden has clearly stated and admitted that there is systemic racism in the United States, which actually means that for minorities, they don't seem to be accorded equal rights with, say, other people of a lighter color in the United States. So nobody is a saint when it comes to areas of human rights and governance. In fact, these are issues that are better handled at the multilateral fora. And indeed, the United Nations system has mechanisms to peer review on issues of human rights, democracy, and governance. So it's better for us as countries in the world to use the multilateral forum, not to have a situation where one country arrogates upon itself the role of the world or the global policeman. It is very unfair to have a system where a country will say, do as we say, not as we do, because that same country is not a saint. And you will notice that America, I mean, in terms of who they say are allies and friends, some of them, if not many of them, are not really performing well. In fact, they are the worst abusers when it comes to the observance of these rights, you know, human rights, governance, democracy, elections, etc. So it's just a victimization of Zimbabwe because a black government took back land from a white settler the community.
My last question to you, Ambassador, is tied to the issue of the abundance of resources which we have as a continent, mineral resources specifically, and the issues that are coming out of COP27, where again the rest of the world is moving green and making a call to Africans to reduce fossil fuels. And so my question is, what is our stance on that as Africa? And are we also seeing any opportunities in the green energy arena where we can frog and be ahead of the game, because we also have minerals that are needed for most?
Well, we are calling for a just energy transition. Most of Europe and even here was developed using the fossil fuels. And what we would want to see is that we be given a much longer time period to phase out the use of fossil fuels. But we could also look at investing in technologies, you know, to reduce toxic emissions and to reduce carbon emissions from the fossil fuels. I think it's just a question of will. You know, they say where there is a will, there is a way. Because we are told that it's very expensive technology. But I think what is very expensive is not to do anything and to see climate change or extreme weather patterns wreak havoc on humanity and on Mother Earth. So we definitely want to play our part in carbon emission reduction. But as it is, we are not the most polluters. We are the least polluters. But unfortunately, we are very vulnerable, more vulnerable than developed countries when it comes to these the effects of these extreme weather patterns. So we are committed to ensure that we combat climate change. We do have resources, some of which are critical in the green energy revolution. Obviously, we need funding, a lot of funding, for us to be able to leapfrog, as you said, into these new energy generation techniques, but they cost a lot of money. And unfortunately for the developed countries, they are not putting the money into the climate global climate financing. You see, so it becomes very difficult for them to insist that we eliminate or phase out fossil fuels when they are not making the resources available for us to embark on new energy generation technologies. So there is a lot of hypocrisy, but it became even much more apparent after the Russia-Ukraine conflict started, because as soon as Europe started facing challenges in terms of gas supply and whatever else energy needs, we saw them one after the other going back to the use of coal, to generate power. And therefore we were saying, oh, but you made some commitments in Scotland to say that you are phasing out. And some of them had even decommissioned some of their coal-fired plants, but they were the first to go back on coal. Why? Because there is need. What more for us? Because there is need to power our development needs, to power our industries. So we have that huge need. So it shows again the hypocrisy of some of our partners, where they want to do certain things because they are pursuing their own national interest, but they want to push us to implement measures that actually cripple our national interest, that cripple our development thrust. So when we call for a just energy transition, we are calling for a global justice. We are calling for equal treatment. And this is why elsewhere within multilateral fora, we are calling for the reform of multilateral institutions, because most of these institutions were created when we were still colonies. And we are saying we want a seat on the table, and we will get it.
A powerful end. We certainly want a seat at the table as Africa. Ambassador Chifamba, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chid.
Thank you so much to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School for partnering with the Africa Policy Journal in this production. And thank you to our viewers